Linda van Tilburg for BizNews. There appears to be a real prospect that coalitions will be a new reality at all levels of government in South Africa. It's not only the polls that indicate that the ANC could drop below 50% of the vote. A flurry of activity is taking place on both the government and opposition sides. And in the BizNews studio with me is TK Pooe, a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, to discuss this. Hi TK, welcome again to BizNews.
Morning Linda, and thanks for having me.
Well, TK, can we start with this all-party workshop that was convened by Deputy President Paul Mashatile to discuss national coalitions? What do you think this means? Does the ANC now accept it will drop below 50%? Why is it sort of, involved in these kind of talks?
Well, look, I think there is a reality that there is a possibility. I think if you listen to them, they still believe 50 is possible, and I think you'd somewhat agree with them. But I think it's the realization, especially after the havoc that's happened in the city of Tshwane, city of Joburg, and other areas, that they need to look as though they are prepared for what might come in 2024. So it's almost like a preemptive strike to say, look, we were not caught with our pants down in 2024 if a coalition were to happen. But I think more of the reality is citizens who I've become a bit fed up with the idea that there seems to be no parameters in terms of how these things must work. It just seems to be, self-interest more than anything else.
So they're looking at certain thresholds. Where do you think they'll settle on eventually for small parties? Because small parties have been very disruptive on local government level.
I think that's the big question, and probably the major issue that's hanging over whatever might happen in the future. It would seem as though the DA and the ANC have coalesced around sort of saying that, listen, key principles needs to happen. I think it's around 2 or 3%. And that basically cuts out a lot of the parties that have been giving both the ANC and the DA headaches. So it's almost like a lovely mutual agreement if it's stuck up. However, I doubt it's going to be something that's just easy just put in there. If anything, if they were to enact it, and we did hear rumors that there is a policy and there's actually acts behind the current government who really want to enforce this, I foresee this going to courts. And I think if it really is not something they can really democratically settle on, it's going to be something that might even push our elections down the line into the August, September, because I doubt that the smaller parties, we're speaking percentages, are simply going to lie down and say, listen, you're going to write us out of existence.
Well, the ANC is pushing for this, but they were the ones that actually ensured that mayors of very small parties, that very small parties became the mayors. So, why would they now suddenly want a threshold?
Well, I think it also goes back to which ANC we're speaking about. I remember a colleague was speaking to Mr. Snooky Zigalala, and his ANC, which I think is more aligned with President Ramaphosa, is quite different. They interpret coalitions quite differently from the ANC in Gauteng. The ANC in Gauteng see it as a survival tool, meaning they will use whoever and whichever party is available to be used to ensure that they can at least control the mechanisms behind the scenes. So that ANC in Gauteng is quite pragmatic and is willing to use any means to stay in power. But the broader national ANC, you're right in saying they are the ones who are very cautious, saying, listen, let's go for something more traditional, which basically means let's go for a threshold, which eliminates us having to deal and address these smaller parties. And if the need does arise, it also leaves us open to a runway to have discussions with the parties who will be above 3%. And I think we all know who they're speaking about, which is a Democratic Alliance, to be, I think, more clear.
So you said to which ANC that you're talking to. So who holds the ultimate authority to make such a decision? Because you mentioned that Snooky Zikalala from the Veterans League said, no, if we have a coalition, the DA is a natural partner, not the EFF. So who will eventually decide? Because you look at the Vets League, the ANC Youth League, there's so many factions within the ANC or within this alliance. Who makes the final decision?
I think that's become something quite interesting a person has been thinking about. Gauteng has always lived in its own planet. I think it's just the Gauteng nature of how things work that we tend to live on our own planet. And that ANC, because they're fighting for survival, has been more pragmatic. Now, everybody ultimately, for some reason, does seem to coalesce around the president. So for now, I think we'd have to say, looking at the different leagues, because I think the ANC Youth League also did say, look, they were not open to wanting to work with the EFF. So I would say in this regard, not necessarily President Ramaphosa, but let's just say the ANC he represents, which I'd have to say is the majority at this stage, they would be said to hold the power. But it would just be interesting if, let's say, Gauteng it's between a 48 and a 49. And all they need is that 2% to come from a party which the national ANC has disagreements with. What would happen there? History tells us, looking at what's happened in the city of Joburg, that Gauteng is not opposed to going it alone. But again, if that were to happen, because remember, it's also important, there is no direct ANC policy which actually brings these parties, which brings Gauteng to the table and forces them to have to listen to the national. Until that is enacted within the ANC structures, there's still some leeway in terms of how they interpret who they're going to work with going forward. But for now, I think President Ramaphosa and his ANC seem to hold all the cards.
Well, especially we're looking at national level. If it happens on national level that the ANC loses power, what would Mr. Ramaphosa have the ultimate decision-making, the vote?
I think that probably would be the worst-case scenario for him. I don't even think he'd survive. Because then the others will say, listen, you're the first ANC president post-1994 to lose us a whole election, to make sure the ANC is out of power. Let's try somebody different who would be more amenable to speaking to other parties. And here we have to say the FF. So this brings it to, I think, the rumor mills of people like Mr. Paul Mashatile come into the fray, who, look, he's quite pragmatic. He's never really been opposed to working with the EFF. So if they do dip below 50 massively, we're talking 45 and below, then I think it's not a given that Mr. Ramaphosa is going to stick around. If anything, the ANC might say, listen, we have to try a different person here quickly who is more open to speaking with parties Mr. Ramaphosa would not be.
So he won't stick around, he will resign, or they will oust him?
I think what's the friendly term they use? They will give him a golden parachute and a golden handshake to say, look, it's time to it's maybe time to consider something. It's not good for your reputation. And Mr. Ramaphosa, who's not really looking like he's enjoying the job much, might be saying, listen, maybe this is a good thing for my legacy that I leave now, and let's allow this new crop to see what they can do.
So if Paul Mashatile becomes the president, that would be a total different scenario because he would work with the EFF.
Yes, Mr. Mashatile, even when he was in Gauteng, he's open to all parties. That's the thing about Mr. Mashatile. And I guess it's the nature of having come to Gauteng that you have to work with people other than yourself. It kind of forces you to do that. And we've never heard him say anything other than the fact that, listen, he believes that he should be in power by any other means. And he's open to speaking to anyone it doesn't matter what party they are. Now, the EFF, I think, might cause some rupture, but he's never really, batted that rumor away.
So if you look at the National Convention coming up for opposition parties, do you think opposition parties could come to some sort of agreement?
Again, it's I guess they kind of fall into the trap of the ANC. When you say the opposition party, I think we have to be quite clear. It's the opposition party minus the EFF, which basically takes away 10% of what they could possibly be. Look, I think it's a good starting point, but the problem I've always had is two things with the way they approach it. One, as a citizen, I have a problem when parties tell me, look, our aim is to unseat the ANC. I mean, every South African citizen knows the ANC has not been great at what they're supposed to do. What we're looking for is for people to say, listen, this is the vision we're coming with for employment and for electricity. And I know these discussions are going to touch on policy issues, so maybe that is going to be great. So I think if they start off with that tangent to say, listen, the aim here is to say, how do we fix South Africa? How do we make sure employment, and how do we make sure that, look, we get to a position where the country is in a recovery mode as opposed to where we are, where we always in an emergency mode of some sort. So I think that's the first thing which they have to get right because they've not been doing it. And secondly, it's the question of, is it the national interest and how are you going to give principles? For instance, if the DA were to stick at 20 or go to 21, does that then make them the leader of this coalition based on numbers? Where does that put parties like Inkatha, who say, but listen, let's say Inkatha does well in KZN, and they're happy to even get the province, whether with the coalition with the DA. That's basically saying within the country of South Africa, it's the ANC that has provinces, it's the DA with the Western Cape, and it's Inkatha with the KZN, which is the largest voter bloc in South Africa. What happens there? So it'd be interesting to see how they work that out, because in the background, the parties like the Freedom Front Plus, again, the PA, I think, has been inviting or has not been invited. So where do you stick them as well? So it's one of those things where it'll be good to see what the principles are policy-wise, and most importantly, secondly, how do they speak in such a way that also doesn't alienate their own voters? Because I could imagine certain voters in the Western Cape who vote the DA and say, look, we like what you are doing and we think you can do it at a national level. Why are you going into coalition with a party like the Freedom Front Plus or something like that? So that for me is going to be interesting how they work that out. Because if they do not, this will always play itself out post-election. And South Africans, especially that's the ones living in Gauteng, have come to see that that's a bit of a problem. So it's good that they're doing it, but we want to see the policy decisions that come out. And most importantly, the lead in direction of who is that, because someone has to lead, unfortunately. That's the nature of how things work. And if they keep being shy about it, these divisions will be exposed post the elections.
Well, who could be the leader of that coalition if it comes together?
That's the one I find quite fascinating. I guess if the DA, and I think we're just going to use the numbers we currently have, because the DA has the largest voter number, in theory, it could be Mr. Steenhuisen. But Mr. Steenhuisen faces a lot of problems. One is just image, that is he really running his own party? Because people do like bringing that up. Now, I'll respect him and say he's running his own party. But secondly, what then do you do with a party like the Freedom Front Plus, who've really come across as quite a sober-minded party and quite sound in how they approach things? And is it really out of the bounds, if you use international norms, to say you actually give it to the person who kind of comes across as the most mature in the room? And in this coalition, the Freedom Front Plus, partially the IFP leader, Mr. Tlhabisa, has also come across as that. And it's also an issue of saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that because Mr. Steenhuisen is the lead person, he gets to lead the coalition. It could just be, Mr. Steenhuisen, we're putting you in parliament as our representative, but the coalition, the inner mechanisms, is going to be handled by a different party. And I think those are the negotiations I want to find to be quite interesting, how they get around them.
You mentioned that the Freedom Front Plus is the mature person in the room. They've actually said, Peter Groenewald has said that he's actually backing the IFP leader to be the leader of this coalition.
That's an interesting, because I think you also said that, look, which is quite rare, I mean, for the Freedom Front Plus to have to admit that race does exist in South Africa. And it is a point, and it'll be interesting to see how that is interpreted. Because, look, the majority of the country is mostly African, but how you sell that again to your own voters, because again, it's one thing to remember. I think one of the things I've always argued for is the Kenyan style of doing a coalition, which is to say you create a mechanism and a vehicle, you name whatever you want to name it, and say, this is a vehicle which we're going into the election with. And this vehicle is neither DA, Freedom Front Plus, IFP. It's a neutral vehicle. You know what the policies are. You know who the individuals are. I always find that in the South African context, that would be a good thing to do. But this issue of saying we might put the IFP leader, it might be Mr. Steenhuisen, kind of shows you the fissures that exist within South African society and politics. So I think it's good that the Freedom Front Plus said it, because it's something that needed to be heard. But it'll be interesting, how do you interpret that, and how do you go to your own voters and say, listen, this is a pragmatic thing to do, but do you guys accept it?
Tell us more about this neutral vehicle for coalitions. That sounds like an interesting concept.
Well, the Kenyan election, and again, Kenya's not had long-running parties like the ANC, DA in South Africa. So what they tend to do is, again, you coalesce around an individual, which makes it a bit easier. And then different individuals come together and say, listen, I'm not going to use my political party. we're going to create, let's call it the X party. And then you basically create a hybrid of policies, the best of each party's policies, to say, listen, we're federalists, we believe in the free market, we believe that, look, on contentious issues such as the social grant, we coalesce around that. And you actually make that your policy offering to the citizens. And I think it's a better way of doing it than leaving citizens to have to guess, to say, look, if the DA goes into this with a patriotic alliance, what does this mean? Because you're being upfront with voters to say, if we were to go into government, coalition or otherwise, this is what we're going to give you. And even to go a step further than policy, we're even telling you these are the individuals we're going to actually put in the National Assembly and across many of the provinces in South Africa. So you're actually giving voters an eye-opener. You're not going to surprise voters. You're going to say, this is what we are, this is what we represent. And you can also manage the many different individuals within different parties. For instance, if it really does come to an issue where, let's say, many of the opposition parties feel, look, Mr. Steenhuisen, we like you because you bring a very powerful DA mechanism. We'd rather want to put you as our candidate as a vice president or as a head of treasury, and then put Mr. Tlhabisa as our president. So we're giving you something in return for you and your party to discuss. And you actually have the ability to say, listen, when it comes to local government, DA, you guys have had a history of good mayors. Why didn't we not even go pick Mr. Jordan Lewis Hill? Or if you want to pick another former DA mayor who's done well, or in the case of the Action SA, Mr. Herman Mashaba, you do well with business, we put you as the head of this. So you actually get to say, it's almost like an all-star, if your football analogy. You get to pick the best from each party, and you get to see what the policies are. And I think that would be a better way to do it in South Africa, because what you then also do is you actually start to conscientize citizens and voters to say, guys, we're actually all in this together. It's neither a DA thing, it's neither an IFP thing, this is a party which wants to save South Africa, give a proper course correction for South Africa. Because maybe an easier way for South Africans to understand it is look at the ANC. The ANC has the SACP, has COSATU, has other affiliates to it. And now, whether they pick the best and brightest from those, I leave that up to your viewers and listeners to decide. But yeah, so it works in that way. Because I think for you to really, and I always like making this point, for you to say you're going to unseat the ANC, it's not about you saying it. It's about you literally giving something very different. Because this is a limitation I think many of these parties have. The ANC is able to speak to CEOs at the GSC. It's able to speak to traditional leaders. It's able to speak to church leaders. It's able to speak to leaders at the mosque. It's able to speak to such a variety of different individuals because of it within the ANC, which is a problem, but also an advantage. There's a lot of things within the ANC. Now, Mr. Steynhuys is limited to who he can speak to. Even Mr. Fabisa from the IFP is limited to who he can speak to. So rather than looking at it to say, look at what are limitations, the question should be, how do we maximize what each party brings to the table? Because if you bring in someone like the IFP, you're bringing in a KZN. If you bring in the Freedom Front Plus, you're bringing in farmers and different unions, it's like Solidarity and the like. And if you bring in, let's say, whether people like him or not, someone like Mr. Gauteng McKenzie, bringing in a different type of Western Cape lookalike. So I think that's what I mean by this vehicle, which I understand why South African politicians, especially the opposition, would not like it, because it basically forces you to go into an agreement to show your cards early. And most importantly, it forces you to leave your kingdom, your little kingdom there, to say, look, I'm going for something bigger. And then as much as we do criticize the ANC for being, I think, rather parochial and a bit selfish, we also have to look at our opposition, who I think have not done so great when it comes to giving South Africa that option that they're looking for, that alternative.
I think that's the problem that voters would have going into the 2024 election. That, if you don't know what kind of coalitions might come up afterwards, so you don't know, you might vote for a certain party and end up with another leader, so people won't trust that. So your vehicle that you were talking about would be stating your position beforehand, that people know what they're voting for.
Exactly, man. I think that's the biggest thing, really, if you're looking to get an alternative to the ANC, as in put your policy offering at the table, be honestly sincere, and most importantly, because South Africans are a cynical lot, show us that, listen, this is what it looks like. Don't make us have to wait till the day after the election. And I think this vehicle will really give them a great option to be able to say, listen, in the background, you can sort out the fights that you want. But most importantly, you've given the policy, you've given the individuals who are going to lead this. And most importantly, you've given us the ability to think outside of the ANC in a real way, as opposed, and obviously you just have to register this with the IEC, because then you actually get rid of lots of other political parties. And then you can even speak about thresholds and saying, listen, for you to join this new vehicle, do you subscribe to believing in the market, SMMEs and the like? And I think it's an easier conversation to have, and for citizens to say, well, at least I know what I'm voting for.
You mentioned right at the beginning that you don't think the ANC might drop below 50%. Is that based on a poll?
Well, it's looking at numbers, because I think sometimes when we discuss the ANC, we have this thing that to believe that the ANC is on 51 currently. The ANC is on 57, 58. And I was speaking to a few colleagues and I was telling them, let's place a bet. Who is more likely to lose an election, the ANC or the DA? The DA, if I'm not mistaken, in the Western Cape is on 55, but it's a 55 which was sliding downwards. The ANC is 57, gives them a bit of insurance. Now, I know people account, and this is what a lot of parties are saying, that look, a lot of people didn't vote. What they notice, they say the local government election. I always like looking at it national. I like comparing apples to apples, national with national, because local government, different interests come into play. I might not be a fan of, let's say, the Freedom Front Plus at a national level, but I actually know the councillor who happens to be someone who I can get along with. So I say, well, look, that's a different relationship altogether. So I think people just I know I always say this, South Africans like shiny things. The shiny new toy is coalition. So people automatically almost prophesy that the ANC will go below 50. Well, look, is the ANC going to drop? Yes, that's not the debate we're having. But the question is how far they're going to drop. And for you to go from 57 to 45, and this is when you're asking me what markers I use, let's look at Mr. Jacob Zuma. South Africans, whether we like it or not, South Africans allowed Mr. Jacob Zuma to survive more than 50%. Now, Mr. Ramaphosa, mattresses and money aside, and a bit of inertia in the fact how he leads. Is he really worse than the previous guy, or do you equate them? Some people equate them. That's fine if that's where you want to go. But I just look at it to say, to go from 57 to 45, even internationally, such a drop, it's so drastic that, look, if I was the ANC, then I'd have to close up shop. So are they going to drop? Yes. The question is how far. Now, could I see them go to a 48, 49? Possibly, but then you just have an Al Jamal who will basically bank them out. Could they go to 50? I think that's more likely than anything else. And I think I think people who are quite trusted in this field who are actually doing polling, not what people think, not what I think, what they're actually doing, sitting down with business, sitting down with citizens, are saying, listen, look, maybe 50 is punishment enough for the ANC. Because the next thing I'm looking forward to is 2029. 2029, new generation of South Africans, people who have lived through the ANC, people who have lived through seeing what the DA is doing in the Western Cape, new political parties on the scene, and I think parties like the EFF would have become normal. So people then, I think, will make a more informed decision in 2029 in terms of where South Africa go. But look, I guess predictions are there to make fools of us all.
TK, Pooe, thank you so much for speaking to us.
No, thank you for having me.